Welcome to another English language A-level video with me, Paul, from the QE here in Darlington. And this one is another aspect of language change in which we look at World English, or should I say, World Englishes, because we think of it as a plural concept. There's no such thing as one single language of English. Think of these islands, think beyond these islands, and there are so many different forms of English, aren't there? So the fundamental questions that we are asking on this video are things like, how and why did English become such a dominant language in the world? What are the different ways of grouping English using countries around the world? And what are some of those characteristics of those different global varieties of English and English as a lingua franca, or ELF? Who controls the English language? Now there's a question. And what are the political implications for the dominance of English across the world? And what effect is English having on other languages around the world? Is it responsible for killing other languages? And we shall also ultimately be looking in our crystal ball to think, what is the future of English? So we won't be covering all of these topics in this particular video, but in our next videos we'll be trying to tick off some of these weighty concepts. Let's start off with a bit of a quiz. So answer these questions for me, will you? Number one, how many people across the globe speak Mandarin Chinese as a native language? How many people across the globe speak Spanish as a native language? How many people across the globe speak English as a native language? And finally, out of the 195 countries, in how many is English the dominant language? Are you confident in answering those questions? Here are the answers. You may be surprised. There are something around about 800 million speakers of Mandarin Chinese as a native language. Okay. Spanish, on the other hand, there are around about 400 million native speakers of Spanish. And how do you think English compares with those two? Well, there are approximately 300 million speakers of English as a native language. We're talking about here from birth as the primary language. And then out of those 195 countries, English is the dominant language in over a third, 75 countries. Okay, so there's some quite interesting statistics that we've got in there. First of all, it's the idea that native English, i.e. L1 English, is not the most widely spoken language in the world. It comes in as third. It's kind of popularly assumed, because we're hearing English all over the world, that therefore it must be the most widely spoken native language, and of course it's not. And think about British English speakers. There are far fewer native British English speakers than there are speakers of other forms of English around the world. I mean, if you make a comparison, for example, between English speakers in the UK and English speakers in Nigeria, you will probably be finding that there are fewer English speakers in the UK than there are in that West African country. There are far more, of course, American English speakers than there are British English speakers. Okay, so you could almost think of a British English speaker as a kind of minority speaker of the language. Now, news this is to most people living in the UK. Much of the world is bilingual. You know, most people in the world are adept at speaking more than one language. In fact, it's normal in many parts of the world to be trilingual. But English is this dominant language, and it's the language of certain semantic fields, isn't it? It's the language of science. So if you're presenting information about a new scientific discovery across the world, you're going to be writing it in English. If you're a business person who is, let's say you're a Malaysian business person and you're meeting a delegation from South Korea, you're going to be conducting your conversations in English. And if you are in the air traffic control, let's say in Turkey, and you're directing an internal flight from the capital Ankara to Istanbul, yes, you're speaking English. and the pilots are speaking English, even though all of you may be Turkish. That's how dominant English is as the language in some semantic fields across the world. Okay, so we have here David Crystal, who talks about some elements. He sort of introduces the idea of international forms of English. And if I can just talk through some of the things that he talks about here, how does Crystal explain the concept of Englishes? Well, his point is that everywhere that English exists, it adopts and adapts, and it takes on new varieties. And in the second one here, international varieties have shaped English ever since it began. He gives us an example, the United States. And you might think, well, how long does it take for an American English form to emerge? A few decades, maybe? Well, not in his opinion, because he's looking at letters which are transferred back across the Atlantic. And within, a very, very short time, I'm talking about weeks and a few years, we've got American English forms coming into the language. Wigwam, moccasin, squaw, for example, to give you 3 examples. So it takes a very, very short time for these new international varieties to emerge. You see the adaptation of the language chiefly in the vocabulary, argues David Crystal. He gives an amusing anecdote of travelling in a taxi in South Africa, and the taxi driver says, "Do we stop at the next robot?" Robot? Right, and robot in South Africa means traffic light. So there are all of these very distinctive varieties of English across the world, and he claims that there are something like 10,000 individual lexical items in South African English which are different to British English. And finally, he says that language everywhere it's spoken is culturally influenced. So you have to look at the kind of idiomatic local expressions that develop anywhere that English is spoken, in the same way as we have idiomatic expressions where we say things like, oh, it was like Piccadilly Circus, meaning that it was extremely busy. There are those sorts of expressions that emerge everywhere that English is spoken. Okay, so it's well worth watching. David Crystal, it's on YouTube, World Englishes, it's called. The status of English in other countries. Right, let's talk about these different forms of English. We've mentioned L1, so this is English as a first language. Okay, so this is English where it's happening in countries where there is an extensive settlement of speakers of English as a first language. So obviously the British Isles, but all of those areas that have been colonized, for example, America and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and South Africa, etc. We're not arguing that there weren't any other speakers of language in those countries. There clearly were. And so what happens to those native speakers, like, for example, in Australia, the Aboriginal languages, they become marginalized. Okay, but there are so many countries in the world where English is an L1 language, where it's a first language. But there are more speakers of L2 English. So this is where English has a special status. It's English as a second language. The kind of countries where you're learning English, or rather the lessons are conducted in English if you're going to high school. Let's say you're studying maths or geography, or you're going off to university, or so many areas of trade and business are conducted in English. So this is L2 English. Think of somewhere, well, let's go back to the example of Nigeria then. So you would say that English in Nigeria is L2. So they're L2 speakers and users of English. Then you've got EFL. So this is English as a foreign language. So these are countries that doesn't have the official status of English, but people choose to use English in order to trade and do all sorts of levels of business. So think of most European countries, for example, Hungary, let's say from the top of my head. There, I'm not saying that people aren't speaking English, but it's English as a foreign language rather than a second language or a first language, predominantly. And then you've got English as a lingua franca. So this happens when speakers of a variety of different languages, they need a common language in which to communicate for trade. So let's go back to the example of, let's say, the Malaysian business person who's meeting a Korean delegation of people. and it may well be that they're using English as a lingua franca. Okay, these are the different forms of English that you're going to come across the world. L1, L2, EFL, English as a lingua franca. Okay, so a bit of geography. So if you were in my class, I'd be getting you to be doing this. I'd be showing you a world map, and then you'd be identifying the countries, which is not necessarily straightforward for all of our students. And then you'd be thinking about which form of English is the most common in these countries. So we've got Ireland, Australia, USA, Canada, Kenya, Pakistan, Egypt, the Philippines, Brazil, Italy, Sierra Leone, Papua New Guinea, Jamaica, and India. Would you be able to locate all of those countries on a map? Would you be able to say what form of English is the primary form in those countries? Let's have a go. There's the world. Here are our countries. So here we've got Ireland, which is over here, of course. And you'd say here, Ireland, well, that's L1. It's the native tongue for the vast majority of the people living in Ireland. Historically, it's interesting, of course, because it was one of the first colonised nations. And so Gaelic Irish has been marginalised. And look, for example, at the work of the British in changing the names of towns and villages in Ireland in the 19th century. So Ireland, we'd say L1. Kenya is a classic example of L2, okay, where English is being used there in order to get on in the world, supposedly, and it's the language of education and the language of the civil service, for example. So that's Kenya, L2. You've got Brazil across here. Now, obviously, the native language there is Portuguese. So it's English as a foreign language in Brazil. In Australia, on the other hand, we're back to the idea of L1 speakers. Remember, we're not saying that English is the only language that is spoken in Australia, but it's the primary language of the settlers. It's L1. Pakistan is interesting because, again, that's a huge country with lots and lots of speakers of English, but it's L2 English. So in that case, it's a bit like Kenya. We have Italy, another of these countries in Europe, where lots of people speak English as a foreign language. We have Jamaica in the Caribbean, with its sad history of slavery and oppression. So there you would say, well, it's L1 because people there have English as a primary language, but you've also got aspects of Creole that developed historically. We have India, which has something in the order of, and it's very difficult for people to put a figure on this, but some people say it's as many as 400 million users of English. Okay, so this is like Kenya and it's like Pakistan, it's L2 English. We have Canada, which is a fascinating place linguistically because we have so many different official languages, of course. English is an L1 language in so many parts of the country. But then, of course, we have the French-speaking states as well, where French and English have equal status. And the indigenous languages have equal status as well. So primarily L1. And then we've got the Philippines, which is L2. A very much American form of English is the norm across there. Okay, so that gives you a bit of an overview. I know it's a bit kind of stereotypical in some ways, but it gives you a bit of an overview of the forms of English that you're likely to hear in different parts of the world. So English travelled and it spread, and largely initially as a result of the colonial exploits of the British in the 17th and the 18th and the 19th century. But in the 20th century, it's the growth of world trade. You have the First and Second World War, and English became this global language, the global language of commerce and of technology. And it's really largely a result not of the British Empire, but of the economic and cultural power of the United States of America. People want to speak the language of the power that they perceive to be socially, culturally, politically powerful. Okay, so let's just finally think about first language English, L1 English. So the idea that this happened in countries where there's been an extensive settlement of speakers as a first language. So this is where native speakers have settled in these countries, places like New Zealand, for example, or America, and they've institutionalized English. Excuse me, my light has gone off. So they have institutionalized English, and it's the official language of state and education and business. And what's happened is that those indigenous languages of the existing native people, I'm talking about like the New Zealand Maoris or the Australian Aborigines or the Native Americans, they're kind of marginalized. So they still exist, but they get low status. So they're kind of pushed to the margin. And these countries largely become monolingual. Okay, they're countries in which English is completely dominant. Okay, and then of course what happens is that you get synchronic variation, where you get different varieties of L1 English being used within a country and between different countries. So you get different forms of phonology and lexis and grammar. Look, for example, at the differences between British English, Irish English, and Scottish English in terms of the accent features, some of the lexical choices, even some of the grammatical features as well. So within L1, you get this synchronic variation. Okay, and so in one of my next video, we will be looking at a particular example and looking at the differences between British and American English and try to figure out how and why those differences and similarities, why are they there? Okay, thank you very much.